This is Pete Feenstra, GetReadyToRock.com, talking to the one and only Ian Anderson from Jethro Tull. Pleasure to have you here, Ian. Once again, you're touring.
Well, it's the one and only Ian Anderson from Jethro Tull, but not the one and only Ian Anderson, because there's a lot of
Yes,
us.
there's a
lot of people keep saying, I really enjoy your show on Radio 2. And it's some other geezer who does a kind of diddly-dee program.
And has been doing it for many years.
Yeah, well, I think he's the fella, even if I'm not wrong, he might well be the guy who was signed to the Island label when we first started playing. We were on Island, and who I think still bears some grudge that somehow I had got him dumped by Island Records because he had the same name as me. And for some time he seemed to persist with this notion that
Wasn't he Ian A. Anderson?
Yeah, that's what he called himself then. I think he's now become brave enough to just call himself Ian Anderson in the hope that maybe I've gone away, but I haven't. But I once got one of his royalty checks, which was interesting. It came through for one of his songs for 10 and sixpence or something, and dutifully we sent it back and made sure it went to the right place. I often wonder if he ever got any of mine.
And he's not Ian Anderson that runs Folk Roots then?
That's the one, I think.
It is.
Same bloke.
Hello, Ian.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's talk about both the solo tour and Jethro Tull, the band. You've started this tour already, I believe.
Well, we've been on the road, doing the Jethro Tull stuff for, since March, and it's been pretty solid since then. But this is the all change.
Yes.
The cusp of a change in repertoire, and a couple of musicians, and the rest of the shows this year are solo concerts in the UK coming up in the next couple of weeks. Although I'm off to Iceland tomorrow to do a couple of shows that are totally unrelated because they're, I don't know, Iceland has obviously been in the news, and people think of the Icelandic bank's collapse as being something that's a hideous plot against the UK and Europe. But I mean, in fact, Icelandic people have had it really rough. The Icelandic krona has been devalued by about a third, and a lot of people have lost jobs, and so being someone who's travelled to Iceland a few times, I thought it'd be nice to go and do a concert with some local artists. We're doing a show to raise money for homeless people and children's charity. So we have 2 shows in Reykjavik coming up, which is unrelated to anything else other than it's, again, more new material we have to learn because we have some guests that are playing with us, so we have to learn their music. They're local, unsigned, relatively little known Icelandic artists, but we have 3 lots of people I have to learn their music between now and the day after tomorrow.
Oh, really? Well, let's start at the beginning. Jethro Tull, I mean, is it fair to say that because the band's always had a broad musical church, that explains its longevity?
Well, it could also have explained its early demise, because when you are the author of a lot of eclectic material, it's easy to think that maybe the breadth of that music is something that attracts people, but it equally can turn people off, because people like their meat and potatoes. They like status quo. They like B.B. King. They like those bands that deliver what it is they expect. It's the blue comfort blanket of musical coziness, especially for middle-aged and older people. They know what they like, and they don't like to be too challenged. So I think if we have longevity as a result of being a rather eclectic and sometimes rather unpredictable band, then it's a testimony not to us, but to the interest and the awareness and the willingness of audiences to grapple with something a bit less familiar than the simple elements of blues or rock music. So I'm not sure whether we would have done better if we just stuck to one. If we just remained Jethro Tull, the blues band, or Jethro Tull, the folk rock band, or
because of course a band is also in part fashioned by the music of the times. I mean, when you became, inverted commas, a soft metal band and won the award for the hard rock thing of the year, I mean, I guess rock was in its ascendancy again at the time. A few years before that, you were a folk rock band in people's eyes. Is that a fair comment?
Well, we've been all things to all people, and yet I think none of those things, in the sense that we are truly an authentic example of a particular genre. We just, I'm not interested in writing within the confines of the genre. I mean, I just write music, and if it comes out sounding a bit like this or a bit like that, or with a bit of this thrown in, and I think that's rather fun. Not to be tied down to living in a certain little compartmentalised area of music. I like the idea that we can drift from one thing to the other.
And you've certainly done that down the years, and still continue to do so.
Get ready to rock radio.
Thinking about the current tour, the solo tour that's coming up, and the 2010 Jethro Tull Best Of tour, how do you approach a 40-year back catalogue? How are you going to determine what you're going to pull from that? Is that in part determined by how it was recorded and the musicians involved, or is it just a personal choice that you'd really like to do that again? And
well, sometimes, believe it or not, somebody says to me, "Oh, I really used to like that song you did back then, and why don't you play that one?" And I say, "Well, I can't even remember how it goes. I don't remember anything about it. I mean, I remember the title and vaguely recording it." And I go back and listen to it and think, "Yeah, actually, that's not a bad idea." And there's a couple of those, 3 of those, I think, in the shows coming up. There are those things that I would never have dreamed of doing had somebody else not said.
And which songs
"Why
are
don't you do that?"
thinking about?
Well, a couple of them are little acoustic songs from the kind of the outtake era of around the Aqualung album recordings.
Really?
But that made it onto best of or compilation albums along the way. And there's a couple of songs from the Stand Up album, which was released 40 years ago, which we'd never played in public. So I never played at all. I only played them once in the studio. But I think that's rather fun, you know, when you get many years later, something you only played once, or maybe twice, or maybe 2 or 3 takes, and that's it. And you put it behind and left it. And it's rather like some sort of vaguely illegitimate child that you encounter later in life.
Yeah.
Whoops, that's one of mine. And in the case of some of this music, it is an uneasy meeting of an old friend or a family member. It can make you feel a little weird because there's such a huge passage of time between. But strangely, once you get into the mechanics of playing it, you know, the actual way in which you played it and your articulated notes or the way you sang it, then these nuances come back incredibly quickly, and it's sort of as if it was last week that I recorded it, because there's something. There is continuity there, you know, and not necessarily that all the songs are great songs, but with some of them I can really feel the link between me now and me back then. You know, it's not like it's a different guy, different. You know, there's definitely a strong sense of
strand there. Yeah.
You know, you feel quite. It was easy to identify with it again, even after so long. Jethro Tull, since the very earliest days of the Marquee Club, has always been a live band first and a recording group second. So it's much easier for me to think of those songs not with any sense of nostalgia, looking back, you know, 30 years or 40 years. It's looking back, well, literally 30 hours since I last played some, you know, a couple of nights ago in Birmingham, and so things like whatever, you know, Aqualung, Thick as a Brick, Locomotive Breath, you know, those are things that I last played a day and a half ago, so it doesn't actually seem like a big disconnect for me to think about those today, because I'm not thinking about the original recording, I'm thinking about the way I play it now, even if it's substantially the same in some cases, because we kind of mess around with the arrangements of some tunes, and others we do very much like the original. And sometimes then we'll go off and do them a different way for a while, and then after a year or 2 we go back to the original arrangement again. So we keep, you know, we try things a different way. And
I'm talking about Stand Up. Is there any plans for reissuing that as the 40th anniversary?
Well, it's been reissued and
done,
you know, tweaked with bonus tracks and things 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. So all of the Tull catalogue is out there, either as physical copy or with iTunes or whatever. So it's all there, apart from some more recent work which just fell out of license with a couple of record companies. So that's just being renegotiated to put that back into catalogue with another. Well, it might be EMI, who this time tomorrow might have decided whether they want to make an offer for it or not. But you know, we're just in that process of talking to a few record companies about some catalogue that's out of license, plus some new material in the can for release next year.
Is there anything that you did at the BBC that's likely to come out at all?
It all really has come out, apart from one thing which is being released later this month, which is the the DVD and CDs of Jethro Tull live at Madison Square Gardens in 1978, which was the first music satellite broadcast, and so that has been retrieved from the vaults by EMI, and the BBC, very surprisingly to me, said, well, yeah, okay, it's not ours. Normally the BBC said, that's ours, we're not having that.
Right.
But the ownership's always been disputed of the videotapes. But the BBC seemed to be happy enough to let it go, which is quite extraordinary, but they clearly decided that they didn't have a legitimate claim on its ownership, the copyright of the recording, and even though it was made for the BBC, but it appears that it may well have been funded by Chrysalis Records back at that time, and therefore fell into the EMI copyright ownership when EMI bought Chrysalis.
Get ready to rock radio.
You've gone through different styles down the years, the styles that vary enormously. I mean, the electronic stuff, the blues stuff, the folk stuff, and how would you put that together in one show? Would you accommodate all styles as part of?
Well,
for example, next year's Tull, what would that consist of?
Well, I think at this stage of the game, when it's a Jethro Tull show, it's billed as Jethro Tull, there's going to be a greater emphasis on the more upbeat rock kind of music, because that's what most people are going to expect, rather than an emphasis on more acoustic or more esoteric stuff. So the emphasis will always be, if it's a Jethro Tull show, it's probably going to be a bit more rocky, especially if it's in the summer, especially if it's an outdoor show.
Yes,
then it's going to move more towards the kind of rock
Locomotive
stuff.
Breath rather than acoustic stuff.
Yeah,
I can
but
see that.
when I play Locomotive Breath from the end of next week onwards, it will be a much more acoustic version in a different time signature, in a different key, but it will also pay its respects to the original arrangement towards the end of the song. But it's an opportunity to look into the song and get a different groove going, and so that's one of those ones we will fool around with for a few months, playing it in a different context.
And having different musicians play it from the ones that played it originally, or have played it down the years, I suppose that keeps it fresh.
Well,
as well.
it gives them the opportunity to put something of themselves into the arrangement if you change it.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. I mean, there's a new drummer, not entirely new to me because he's done a few shows with us already this year, but Mark Mondesir, who's a jazz drummer in the UK, he's playing on the stuff from here on into the end of the year.
Excellent.
So he obviously brings a slightly different feel and a different touch to it compared to Don Perry, the Jethro Tull drummer, who's more of a, I don't know if you want me to say an 80s rock drummer, but that's the era in which he grew up as a professional musician during the late 70s, early 80s. So he has a way of playing which is much more American rock. Yeah. Whereas Mark's music is a more delicate touch of perhaps it's not really jazz, but it's just that he has a slightly different way of figuring things, and it's a more consistent and perhaps slightly lighter touch. Although when he plays the rock songs, he steps it up and gets louder and bigger in his playing, but it's just nice to work with other musicians, which I try to do, particularly in the last 10 years or so. I do try to play with other musicians, usually much younger than me, inevitably, but sometimes older, and I have this real fond belief that there's always something new to learn from working with another musician. They teach you something if you're receptive to it. Even the youngest, most naive musician, and the next couple of days in Iceland, we'll be meeting some of those, and they'll probably be very nervous, and they'll probably be very twitchy because they won't have played that much in public before, but I have something to learn from them. There's bound to be something they can show me that I didn't know. Some little approach to music, and hopefully vice versa. They'll get something positive out of working with me and the other guys. But I'm always of the belief that as a musician, you shouldn't stop learning. And a lot of musicians that I've met hit 30 and think, that's it, I know everything I need to know, I can just keep doing this for the rest of my life, and I've earned my, I've got my wings, I can fly the plane, that's it. But it's not like that, because to take that analogy further, if you are flying the plane, you have to go and retrain every so often. New instruments, new techniques, new airports, new landing systems, new aircraft, you don't stop learning if you're a pilot, and you don't stop learning if you're a doctor. You know, you get your bit of paper, but you have to keep up with developments in medical science. Musicians, on the other hand, especially classical musicians, think, right, we've done that. We've done our 8 years, 10 years of study, and now we just sit here.
Sessions.
Well, rubbish. You know, they are the people who just close their minds to ideas, and I get.
But do you find that when you're
infuriated.
working with orchestras?
Well, I find it with some people in some orchestras, yes, that they are very set in their ways, and they don't want to be pushed, and very often they're very deficient, particularly in rhythmic terms. They don't have a confident, solid feel in their playing when it comes to strict tempo, and particularly with awkward time signatures or anything syncopated, they really struggle to play it. And you know, to us it seems really easy, and they struggle, you know, to the point where you think these guys are musicians and they can't play a dotted quaver. You know, it's just not in their soul. You know, they just don't seem to have it. And yet, the other half of the orchestra are probably quite interested in meeting the challenge. It's just you usually get this bunch of people, very often in the second violins, who are these kind of rather grizzly people who didn't quite make it to being first violinists or being soloists, who are kind of sitting there in the rank and the file, as staunch union members who don't, you know, looking, when's the coffee break coming up?
Get ready to rock radio.
The live thing is still very, very important to you. You're willing to undergo the rigours of touring.
Well, so far, but I mean, there are places that I'm afraid are kind of crossed off my list, but for practical reasons. I'm not a happy flyer, so regretfully, I don't see me going back to Latin America. It's not a route that I want to fly. And ironically, I told our Latin American promoter last year, I said, I just really have difficulty in the idea of getting on a plane and travelling that route, because I always have a really scary flight with a really bad turbulence, and it is because you go through that tropical zone that brought down the Air France flight a few months ago. It's virtually all year you're going to get some bad thunderstorms and turbulence, and you can't avoid it. It's like going to Armenia, probably for the one and only time, a couple of months back, and that was really rough and bouncy on the approach into Yerevan, going across the Black Sea. And I spoke to one of the pilots on the return journey, and he said, yeah, it's always like this. He said, that's the nature of the terrain. We always get a bumpy flight.
Talking about Armenia, you've been all over the globe with Tull now. You've worked territories that other people haven't. I'm just amazed that in some cases that people know so much about Jethro Tull. I mean, does that surprise you at all? Well,
of course it's surprising if you go to somewhere like Armenia and you find that there's you've got a sold-out concert and lots of people know your music, but it's had 40 years to be able to spread around the globe. So yes, there is a great support for British rock music. It's not just Jethro Tull. I mean, it'd be the same if it was Deep Purple or Yes or let alone Led Zeppelin or whoever. I mean, these bands have left a really big and indelible mark in parts of the world that, particularly those that were deprived of Western music at the time that it was first created. So it may be that music of the early 70s didn't really get to India until the late 70s. But when it got there, maybe 10 years later, it still had this profound effect on the development of a country. It's the same thing in all the ex-USSR countries. But bands like Jethro Tull and Deep Purple, as well as, I suppose, to some extent, the pop groups, but it had a big role to play because it represented a musical freedom, a musical lack of censorship, which was so obvious in those countries for young musicians trying to play their own music. And so when under Gorbachev's watch, in the period of perestroika and glasnost, he relaxed things a little bit, and back in around 87, I think it was, the Russian state record label finally did a deal to release a couple of official Western releases, which were one of the Beatles albums and a Jethro Tull album. And they were the first two records ever to be officially released on the Melodia label in Russia, which was... And many years later, when I met Mr. Gorbachev in Germany, and I thanked him for this little moment, knowing that he would know nothing about it, because it was just part of the machinery that relaxation took place. But I said, nonetheless, if it wasn't for you, those records wouldn't have been released. It helped diffuse a period of time when the black market was rife with this illegal and dangerous Western music, but it was diffusing it and bringing it out into the open that allowed for a peaceful transition from the very rigorous controls of the communist era to the much more laissez-faire attitude that worked for Russia and all the Eastern Bloc countries in the latter part of the 80s and through to the 90s. And, it's a great. I mean, Gorbachev is so important in that transition period.
Thinking about the way that rock music has spread its way around the globe, and Tull's music has done the same thing, was there ever a sense of frustration as on your behalf with rock moving into a kind of niche position as it is in Europe now, as opposed to before when really you were the orthodoxy at one point? And as a result of that, I mean, access to the media becomes more difficult. Getting your music played other than the internet becomes ever more difficult. Are you ever frustrated by that?
Well, I think it's just a fact of life. I think it's much more frustrating for young musicians today who are trying to make their voices heard and to get a life as a musician at a time when the world is a very overcrowded place. Not overcrowded. Well, it's overcrowded full stop. We're 6.5 billion people here now, and 5 billion of them want to be in a pop group. So it's very, very hard for any young musician to get a start in a business where people expected to play for nothing. I was just saying to my daughter, at lunchtime today, that when I first came to London, or before I first came to London, I probably made £20, £30. We got paid as a band for playing in some little club, a little pub this size.
And you kept changing the name of the band to get a gig.
Yeah. But the point being that £20 or £30 is about £400 or £100 today.
So there, yeah.
And £400 today is the £400 that my son does not get with his band when he plays some little club in London. He's expected to do it for nothing because no one gets paid. There's so much competition, you're expected to play for nothing these days, and that's the problem. There is absolutely no money in doing it, and you're not going to, if you make a record, the only records you're going to sell are going to be, to the punters on the way out. You may sell a little bit of merch, 20 CDs or whatever you might sell. But to get a physical record deal and to get distribution nationwide and to be sold in virtually the one and only retail outlet that exists, which is HMV, forget it. Your chances are absolutely minuscule. So it's much more frustrating for today's new and young musicians than it is for old folks like us, whose music still does get played and still changes hands both in the physical realm and the digital realm. At least we can't really complain that we're being ignored. But so many young musicians are being ignored because it's just logistically and just the numbers crunch of it all is that there are just so many people chasing the same little moment of glory, and most of them are not going to find it.
Get ready to rock radio.
And the Ian Anderson tour that you're currently doing stops at Peterborough on the 15th, I think Kingsley on the 16th. Buxton Opera House, presumably that is. That's a lovely place.
I've never. Yes, well, the interesting thing is a lot of these places I've never been to. Never been to King's Lynn, never been to Buxton, never been to Bridlington.
And Bridlington, I should mention that. And then it moves on to Lancaster, Yeovil, Cheltenham, Aylesbury, Salisbury, Tunbridge Wells, and finishes in Worthing Pavilion for all the lucky people in.
And for the majority of those venues, the first time I've even not only never played there, but I've never even been to the town before, which is what I wanted to do, is try and do a little tour of little theatres in places I've never been to before. And that for me is a lot of fun, just to know that in our small green and sceptred isle there are lots of little places that tend to be forgotten. Certainly we've never been there as Jethro Tull in all the years we've been together, so it's an opportunity to go and play in some little places that I'm quite excited about visiting. Even if it's just a few hundred people show up to out of curiosity, I'm very happy to see them.
It's been a pleasure talking to you,
Ian.
Thank you very much to Prakash on the camera. Good afternoon.